The March on Washington in 1963 was a pivotal event for America psychologically because the cultures and the races, we were so segregated that most white society had a hard time believing that anything constructive could come out of racial protest of any kind. And the media were fearful of this protest. They really expected violence. Washington prepared for the worst. It's not widely known, but basically official Washington anticipated Armageddon because subliminally people just feared you couldn't get large numbers of black people in the nation's capital without bloodshed. And so they stockpiled plasma and canceled liquor sales and even canceled baseball games. So fearful were they. And then instead they get what the march was always intended to be, and what the organizers of the march always said it would be, was a bunch of citizens coming together to petition for basic American rights, and that these are your fellow Americans, and you're not going to find what they say that odd, except they're going to be very insistent that you confront these issues. Because this was such a big deal and it was going to be on national television and the Civil Rights Bill was pending, all of the speakers wrote out their speeches. This was very formal. Dr. King didn't, he wrote out all of his basic sermons before he started his career, and then he used them and incorporated them and preached off of them for the whole rest of his life. But this one he wrote anew, and he wrote a very formal speech, explicitly referring to the fact that it was 63, 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, but that black people were still not freed, even though Lincoln had freed them. He preached a powerful and broad, but rather formal sermon. And when he came to the end of his allotted time, it hadn't really connected with the audience. And there's a lot of, unmistakably, because we have the text, we know that he veered off the text, and we know exactly when he veered off it. And we can literally see him kind of going forward and faltering, and then let us go forward with creative goodwill, but I have a dream. And many sources say that he was either trying to figure out what to do, or that there were actually people who had heard him give these riffs saying, "Tell them about the dream, Martin." A lot of people say that Mahalia Jackson, who was one of his inspirations and good friends, and sang that day and was behind him, was saying, "Tell them about the dream, Martin," which is not implausible because a lot of people were commenting. But anyway, the last part of the speech, which is all the speech that is memorable, the "I have a dream" riff, the "Let Freedom Ring" from every mountain and molehill, from Stone Mountain of Georgia, from the Rockies, and all over the country, the "Let Freedom Ring," and "With This Faith." So there were a series of what he called rhetorical riffs, many of which he had used in other sermons, ending with "Free at Last," that he put together. And that was what preachers did. Preaching had a lot in kin with jazz musicians, that you would try out things, and if they worked, you would refine them, and you knew how they would had a rhythm with an audience, and you would put these riffs together. And so that the memorable part of the "I Have a Dream" speech is not what was specially composed for the day and formal. It's the part that was really a fusion, like a master jazz musician, of rhetorical runs that were close to his heart, that he had tried out before and that he put together again in that big march spontaneously. When he says "Let freedom ring," and he invokes the promise of America, and the final lines are, and when that day happens, all God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing together in the words of the old Negro spiritual, "Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, I'm free at last." And literally, Dr. King was inviting white America into black culture and saying we can all join that, because you will recognize that for all the hardships black people have suffered as slaves in this country, not only did we survive, but we contributed a lot of things that you unconsciously value in music and humor, but particularly music grew out of African American experience. So when you come in and join hands and sing the old Negro spiritual, you're going to like it. So he's really inviting America into black culture to become a cross-cultural community by accepting black culture. But the way the march was portrayed was just the opposite. If you looked in the newspapers, and if you looked on the cover of Life magazine, it said, it showed pictures of well-dressed black couples and said they're American Gothic, they're behaving just like white people, and that the march was well-behaved, and that they were all well-spoken, and that some of them, you know, liked Mozart, and it was almost like that message that a polyglot culture could enlarge America by recognizing the genius and the contributions of its African American strains was beyond people at that time. And sadly, they processed it the way they wanted to process it. But at another level, they said, okay, this is not as dangerous. Maybe this is not so bad after all. And in that sense, the March on Washington was an essential step forward. I am concerned that a lot of people who care about race relations often turn against the spiritual underpinnings of the civil rights era, because I think the lesson of history is that people do that at their peril. I understand why they don't want to be doctrinaire, and they don't want to impose a religious test on anything. But to me, that's the great thing about Martin Luther King that makes him unique as a communicator, is that he always had a spiritual root for his political message that was compatible and never offended anybody, which was a miracle, that he never got attacked for mixing church and state, even though he had many enemies, and he was talking about politics and religion all the time. But as I like to say, he put one foot in the Constitution and one foot in the Scriptures and said, take your pick. You know, this is about equal souls before God and equal votes under the Constitution, and that's our inspiration. That's our common inspiration. Most people found some way to sidestep the moral and the political challenge of the message that he was trying to propose behind the movement. And that's true today. That people are trying to pigeonhole him in a way so that they don't have to confront what he really meant, which is that the whole purpose of this country and the way we really measure the country is by the standards that he set forth, which are wholly consonant with what other founders do. I call Dr. King a modern founder in the sense that he was doing just what Jefferson and Lincoln and the other American founders were doing in their most spiritual moments, which Lincoln certainly had them, which was to confront very stubborn forms of evil and subjugation and figure out a way to transform them into equal citizenship. You know, that's what the founders did. And in that sense, Dr. King was a leader for all Americans, not just about segregation for black people, but for all of Americans about having a more perfect kind of freedom. And most people don't like that challenge, so they will figure out a way to diminish it and sidestep it. But I don't try to get people not to do it. What I try to do, and I don't know whether this is the right approach or not, I say, fine, if you want to say that Dr. King, because in his I Have a Dream speech, he said he wanted his children to be judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. If you want to interpret that to mean that he didn't want to think about race, or that he was in a post-racial society and therefore we shouldn't talk about race, that's fine with me if you'll tell me that you're making anywhere near the effort that he made every day to see character across the divide of race. He spent every day of his life talking to people who disliked him, going into audiences that were hostile to him, reaching across lines, trying to communicate so that he could not be naive and silly about the fact that there were hatreds in the society, but that he was always trying to reach across them in the hope of establishing character. sadly, a lot of the people who say, let's just talk about character and not about race, don't make any effort, a thousandth of the effort that he made every day to get outside of his comfort zone and take that message and to create those new bonds. So it's basically, it's not the message that a lot of people make, it's just whether they're sincere in really trying to take it to heart and trying to make it real across the lines that divide us, because that's the inspiration of the movement.